My cousin stole loads of jewelry, so I stole his inheritance. I do not speak lawyers, so please forgive me. Backstory. 25 years ago my aunt passed away when I was a baby, leaving my two cousins who were both in their early 20s alone to fend for themselves. My grandparents, who were very wealthy, put a clause in their will that grandkids will receive half of their share of inheritance if a parent passes before the children reach age 30, and then the other half when my grandparents eventually passed. Both my cousins received a very sizable inheritance coupled with the money they got from selling my aunt's house. The younger of the two paid off her college loans and was able to buy property. She still lives on the same plot of land. The older sibling blew all of his money, straight out of a book of the Bible. Within 6 years, he was back to living in a condo working as a police officer. Everyone in our small family knew he had a substance issue, so he was barely making ends meet with his officer's salary and buying copious amounts of drugs. The next 4 years my cousin went to rehab 3 times, sponsored by my grandparents. He sobered up after getting his girlfriend, now wife, pregnant. Absolutely wretched woman. She saw my grandparents as payday and essentially baby-trapped my cousin, thinking it was her ticket. Within 7 years they had 3 kids, so she is locked in tight. She's a nurse, and with 3 kids around they always needed a little boost. Guess who they would always ask? You got it, my grandparents. Being the kind spirits they are, they always lended a hand. My father, mother, sister and I got sick of it very quickly. My grandmother unfortunately passed away when I was 17, leaving my grandpa as the last remaining. I was undoubtedly my grandfather's favorite among the grandkids, which left a real sore spot in the mouth of my cousin and his wife. I had 2 more years at home before college, so I lived with my grandpa to keep him company and help take care of him. My cousin and his wife hated this, so much so that whenever they came to visit and I was not home, they would send their 3 gremlins into my room to destroy it. My room had double doors, so it couldn't be locked. This was the start. The longer I lived there, the more they would mess with me. My cousin even went as far to place one of those little mechanical noise makers in the cabinet in my room, the ones that play sounds at random intervals that make you think you're insane. Thankfully, my German Shepherd would always hear it, and after a week or so she finally found it. They did this to distance me and deter me from taking care of Grandpa so they could swoop in and be the heroes. This continued until one of the kids found my gun. By this time, I was 18 and in the possession of a firearm. I use quotations because my grandfather has guns, but cannot aim and shoot them anymore due to arthritis and nerve degeneration, so when I moved in, he placed all the weapons in my hands should the need of self-defense arise. But should he see them out for any reason other than cleaning, there would be hell to raise. Being very well trained with guns and having a sense of pride in defending my home, I took this responsibility very seriously. I always kept a handgun in a locked container in my nightstand with the key on a high shelf out of reach from the gremlins. One fateful day, I am out getting my grandfather food when I come home and my older cousin, his wife and my grandfather are staring at a gun on the table. It was my gun that I kept in the lockbox. It was loaded and had a bullet chambered. I always keep a magazine in the lockbox, but never loaded into the gun. The lockbox was nowhere to be seen. My cousin claimed one of the children found the gun and was playing with it. I was 100% certain that he either found the key or broke the lockbox open to get to it and load it. As a 6-year-old would not be able to reach a key I could barely grab, figure out what it was to load my gun and chamber it. I tried my best to explain what my cousin had said was bullshit and that I never keep my firearms loaded in the house. But my cousin, who is a cop, scolded me on gun safety and threatened to have me arrested if I didn't leave and hadn't arrested me yet. Because we're family. I was asked to collect my belongings and go back to my parents. My cousin had won, or so he thought. The next day I apologized to Grandpa and explained to him there was no way one of the kids could have gotten the key. He agreed with me and he apologized, but he thought it best I move out until things cooled down, but once they do I would be welcome back home. Our relationship was a little fractured due to disinformation provided by my cousin. A month later, my grandfather died of a heart attack at 86. I was devastated. I was just beginning to get back into rhythm with him and rebuilding the trust that was somewhat shattered. To this day, I am still unsure of what kind of man he saw me as due to my cousin. Immediately, my cousin and his wife began sucking up to my dad. As they had sealed payday with Grandpa, it was time to move on to the uncle. This persisted for a month or two. I wouldn't stand for it. Then came time for the will. My grandfather's lawyer read out the will to me, my father, mother, and sister in our home. Our two cousins would be briefed individually on their share of the estate, per my grandparents' request. Then the miracle line in the will comes to fruition. If anyone attempts to claim any part of the estate that is not assigned to them, they forfeit any assets they are supposed to receive and will be divided equally among the remaining family members. This was basically their way of saying, if you try to claim more than you're given, you get nothing. My father is supposed to receive every piece of physical property, aside from 2 or 3 items he set aside for me, from my grandparents, as he is the only remaining child. The revenge. I hatched my plan. I called my cousin and told him all of Grandma's jewelry was to be donated to a charity auction. Grandma's collection of gems and medals was extensive, to say the least, so a charity event wouldn't care if a few pieces didn't make it right. It was a lure of gargantuan proportions that my greedy bastard of a cousin could not resist. He bit right on it and headed over to my grandparents' house ASAP, determined to snatch up as much as he could. A handful would send his kids to college. Regardless of what I said, the jewelry was never going to go to him anyways, so his actions were purely his own, since none of it was destined to be his. Coincidentally, Dad was on his way with the lawyer to my grandparents' house to overlook everything, formality stuff. According to my dad's testimony, my cousin had 3 shoeboxes worth of Grandma and Grandpa's jewelry piled on the kitchen counter ready for loading into his car. My dad and the lawyer stood in the kitchen wondering why it was all there when my cousin walks in from my grandparents' bedroom with a 4th and final shoebox. The jig was up, and he put 2 and 2 together that I set him up, which was true. But there was no penalty against me for exploiting my cousin's greed, so he would fuck himself over. It's worth noting that between the 18 years from my aunt's death and my grandpa's death, their wealth had increased several times over. So my cousin felt cheated and expected to receive just as much as my sister and I, despite receiving half of his already and blowing it. Throughout this whole ordeal, his younger sister, my other cousin, has not had a problem at all and is still weeping over Grandpa's death like the rest of us. However, just like that, my cousin lost enough money in the course of 30 minutes that made him contemplate his sanity over greed. My cousin's bitch of a wife apparently filed for divorce a few weeks later. We haven't heard from him in nearly 6 years, as he is all but disgraced now. You can call this a fairy tale ending, and on this particular part of the story it somewhat is. There was a massive lawsuit by an unknown family member involving the IRS and FBA later on, but honestly, I would rather have my grandparents. Leave comments if you want the other part of the story, but it's not really a revenge story. When your ex tells you to move out while she's on a work trip, because the guy she cheated on you with is moving in, you get very creative moving out. I did this to an ex who asked me to move out while she was on a work trip and told me she was coming back with her new boyfriend. We were still together when she left. I got these little noisemakers, battery-powered ones the size of a quarter, that emit sounds at just the right volume that you aren't sure if you really heard it, so quiet that 2 people could be sitting in an average-sized room, and while one can barely hear it, the other wouldn't hear a thing. They last ages, and fit perfectly in light fixtures and in wall outlets. I got a box of 20 of them for like $100 on eBay and got so creative all over the house, her car. I even hid them in a boat her father got her, rich family, and she grew up sailing. Now these little bastards make a noise at complete random intervals. Could be minutes, could be hours, could take a whole day off. They cycle noises like children laughing, a dying breath as they called it, a whistles, scratching noises. Some other ones I can't remember, but you get the idea. It was so unpredictable it was near impossible for someone to just figure it out. Months go by, I get a new place, get my life back up. Now we had a few friends in common, and one of them I kept up with. They were kinda sour about how she ended things, but they had grown up together and kept up the friendship, loosely talking and catching up on occasion. I never really asked about her, but one day we get to talking and he's wanting to prank some friends on a camping trip, so I tell him about the noisemakers. As I'm telling him about them, he slowly starts making this face, like he's gradually losing his shit. He's got this huge grin on his face and asks me, "You put these in, X, shit didn't you?" And when I admit, he starts laughing hysterically. Turns out her new boyfriend had only lasted a few months, and had left telling her that he couldn't handle whatever was going on with them and their mental states. Turns out for a while they had both heard things, and sometimes only one would hear them, which gave the illusion that something really fucked with them was going on in their heads at different times. They couldn't figure it out, and eventually he wanted out completely, and having run down all the crazy list of shit people who are hearing voices would think, ended it believing he had been infected with some brainworm the government was putting in vaccines or something like that. It was amazing. I hadn't expected to hear anything about it. I rode that train for weeks. When it went away, I got another hit of that high. She moved out, told her parents she didn't want the house and to give it to her brother or sell it. Wouldn't tell them why. I always tell people who ask about her that I hold no grudge, and don't tell them the part where I totally fucked with her so bad I overshot that got her backstage and hit the blissful state of satisfied with my work. My wife knows this story by heart because it's her favorite one to tell.
When someone tried to get you fired, but you have a reversey card. This incident blew up in March 2021. In the middle of lockdowns and stuff. It would probably be recognizable to people I work with. Hopefully they don't read this thread, It's a story about someone whose ambition was bigger than their ethics and the law, and it coming back to bite them. It's a bit long story. At the time, I was working as a manager in a mid-sized business. While I was there, I was assigned a new member to my team. I'll call her Evil. Evil was in her mid-20s and was pretty fresh out of college. She was the kind of person who could talk your ear off about all of her ideas and plans and what she was working on, but never really seemed to have anything to show for it. When I talked to her about clients complaining that she wasn't getting back to them, she would always have an excuse about how difficult they were, how snowed under she was, and how she had written an email but it must have gotten lost in spam, so on and so forth. Basically never her fault. It got to the point where after one of our monthly meetings I called her in and explained that if she couldn't get her tasks done she needed to let us know so we could help delegate resources to make sure things weren't slipping through the cracks. I'll admit, I was pretty direct. Her performance was impacting the whole team, and my job was literally to keep the team on track. I get that people can be under pressure, that there can be stuff going on at home which impacts work, and that sometimes people need a bit of help. But if every time I ask about a project you say, yep, everything's good, I've got it under control, and then it all falls apart and your only response is to blame the client, we have a problem. I explained that I wasn't going to start formal performance management or anything like that, but from now on I'd like her to check in with me on Monday mornings for 10 minutes to go over objectives for the week and to check if she needed support with any of her clients. I know it isn't fun to be micromanaged, so I tried to keep these check-ins short and mostly just offer assistance on stuff. She clearly hated my guts though, and apparently was hatching her own ProRevenge. Now part of my role included use of a purchasing card, which wasn't in my name but I had access to. I was given the card to basically make small purchases for the office or spend up to $500 on clients. The card was kept in an office I shared with another team manager, where we both could access it when we needed it. One day I get a call from accounts asking about a few abnormal purchases on the card, a Photoshop subscription, a couple of Uber Eats orders, an HBO subscription, etc. I say I don't know anything about them and they should check with the other team manager. Apparently the other team manager didn't know anything about them either because after the weekend I get called into the big boss's office. After my colleague and I had denied involvement, accounts had started calling Adobe and Uber and stuff to find out where the transactions were coming from. They said that not only were the accounts in my name, they were registered to an email address with my name in it too. Example, word.roll3@domain.com or something. I can't describe what it felt like to be in that meeting. I felt physically sick. I couldn't work out what was happening. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was about to get fired and I couldn't understand how that was even possible. The director was going on about how access to the card was a privilege and that I had signed an agreement about appropriate use and so on and so forth. I denied that I had been using it inappropriately, and the boss listened, but I could tell he wasn't that convinced. To be honest, in my head I was gaslighting myself and worrying that I had somehow saved the card in Google and maybe my wife had been accidentally using it or something. It was terrible. And I found myself apologizing and saying I don't know how this happened. I assure you that I know that none of those expenses are appropriate uses of company funds. There must have been some kind of mistake. Can I please have the details and look into it, etc., etc. When I finally got out of that office job and still in fact barely, Evil was waiting for me at my office door. She was grinning from ear to ear and sweetly explained she had been waiting for our morning meeting. I told her something had come up and we'd do the meeting tomorrow, and she said, "Oh, will you be in tomorrow?" Confused because I didn't know I was in a ProRevenge thread at the time. I just replied, "Yes, why would I not be in tomorrow?" And she just sipped her tea and said, "Oh, no reason," turned around and went back to her desk. Something felt off, but I was still worrying about what had happened with the boss, so I spent the next couple of hours calling my wife, calling Adobe, and doing the same legwork that accounts had done. It became very obvious that someone had been using my name and the company card to spend a bunch of money online. Had I been hacked or something? Personal info on the dark web, and these hackers just really wanted Photoshop and Wendy's delivered. It was the Uber Eats that was her undoing. After getting on the phone and talking through what had gone on, and obviously giving my name for the account and everything, the fellow on the phone told me where the food had been delivered. It was in our city, which made me rule out straight away any notion of my data being sold online or something. Now I was suspicious and pissed. I don't like to think the worst of people, but now I was listening to my gut. I pulled up Evil's employee information and checked her address. I pulled it up on Google Maps, dropped a pin on her place, and then looked for the address Uber Eats had given me. It was the corner of her effing block. I was furious. When she left work for the day, I got IT to give me access to her laptop. Sure enough, when I opened up her domain.com account, under her listed accounts was word.roll3@domain.com. There were some things she had been smart about. The IP address she had been using was the office, which would have tied back to me. She had even had the food delivered to a different address. She had even made a fake email address. But saving her passwords on a work computer was a mistake. I called the boss that night and explained what I had found, and kept the guy with me to support the fact that I hadn't just logged into her computer and made it all up. The next day the boss called her into the office and fired her so bad there were red trucks lining up outside the building. When she teary-eyed left his office, I made sure I was standing in the hall sipping a cup of tea. It had gotten cold while I waited for her but still tasted sweet. I hope she went home that night, because if she did, she would have received some nice goodbye Wendy's delivered by Uber Eats. Paid for on my personal card, of course. Revenge and justice can be the same thing, right? In the end, she was fired. The boss apologized and we were on good terms when I left in October for a new gig. She never apologized and I haven't seen her since. The boss decided not to get police involved and neither did I, just didn't want the hassle.
I was able to simultaneously gain a $30,000 per year pension from my mother while wiping my piece of shit father's retirement. My father is the Canadian Satan. Growing up with him was less than fun, and I can assure you, based on witnessing it, he was a less than fun husband. I'd go on about what a piece of shit my father is, but instead I'll quote a judge. "You're the most despicable human I've ever had in my courtroom." And that's coming from a family court judge. I read this whining endorsement of my dad's personality in the court documents I acquired related to his divorce with my mum. The same place I discovered the fuckery he had engaged in to steal from my mum. It's also where I found the information I needed to get one over on him so severely he's going to disinherit me. A frame of reference about my father is that he's a pathological narcissist and behaves exactly how those people are compelled to act. They aren't generous people, and punching them in the wallet is like a slap shot to the taint from Gretzky. He's kind of like Donkey from Shrek, but also Joseph Stalin, a monstrous jackass. Chapter 1, Hosea 3:8. Those that sow the wind shall reap a whirlwind. Our actions always have consequences, and my padre has plenty to answer for. My attempts to hold him to account didn't jump to immediate jihad. They started with diplomacy and a therapist. About 10 months ago, when our tale begins, I was going through some stuff. Stuff being a whole lot of PTSD related to both my dad's abuse and my job as a paramedic. He did a ton that affected me deeply, things that I needed to move past, along with all that other razzmatazz from 15 years of EMS. And so trying to move past and work through everything, I quit drinking, started turning my untreated PTSD into treated PTSD, and thinking having my dad involved might help me and our relationship. Well, I seriously fucking misjudged that one, so you'll probably be unsurprised to hear that conversation went swimmingly. I'll spare you the lurid detail, but when I broached the subject with him, our back and forth degenerated into visceral hate, with him screaming at me that I'm a failed paramedic, liar, and piece of shit alcoholic. While I have a certain pride about my job, I have more pride in my 14 months sobriety, so hearing this from my old man might have caused me to behave a bit psychotically. I got right pissed off at him and decided to dig up every bit of dirt I could, see what kind of man he actually is and has been. When it was convenient, I hoped in the mystery machine before taking a trip to the courthouse to unleash my inner gumshoe. Everything is public record. So I bulk bought copies before retiring to my easy chair to read, plot, and pet my white long-haired cat. For good measure, I obtained a file of divorce document from my mother. Soon enough I hit upon a line of inquiry worth following up on. It seems that during the final settlement of my parents' divorce, 2002, my mother was awarded 1/3 of my father's employment pension. She was a stay-at-home mother and could not earn one herself, so it was given to her by a judge. Mighty fucking strange, because my father, as he brags, took a nearly full pension and retired a bit early. No way that asshat was living the last 10 years after retiring early on a 2/3 pension. He isn't constantly bitching about it. So I asked my mother if she was collecting a pension from his job or had cashed out the value, 100K plus at the time, 20 years ago. No to both questions. Well, that's interesting. I wonder if that's collectible on, and what 20 years of compound interest from a pension fund makes it worth. Well, I did eventually find out, along with the fact that my dear old dad had been collecting my mother's portion for 10 years, in hilariously open violation of a legal order from a judge. Why didn't my mother pursue this sooner? A combination of being unable to afford a lawyer, being his victim for 20 years, and pessimism after so much of his continued dodging obligation to the order. She just quit. There is effectively no statute of limitations he could hide behind, because the wording of the settlement. Insofar as I could tell, I had him dead to rights and my mother would be collecting. It would be a slam dunk. I just needed to hire a lawyer to help me, so I set out to find the most unbalanced, bloodthirsty psychotic who passed the bar exam. Chapter 2. At to Pension Lady. As it says in the good book, screw unto others as they would screw unto you, so that's what I set out to do. The misanthropic sociopath I hired for legal counsel suggested we send a demand letter to the pension office to try and remedy it before filing what would undoubtedly be an easy win for him. I agreed in spirit and instead phoned up the pension office and got put through to the woman managing my father's file. Well, she was a delight, and it was a trivial matter for me to get her to loathe my dad. We talked for 45 minutes, and I swear if you'd given me another hour, I could have convinced her to suicide bomb his house. In all our conversations about life, families, and relationships, we got down to some things of note. Since I could show her correspondence her office had sent to my father, my mom, on some years ago and ongoing for 5 consecutive years, trying to resolve this matter, which he had ignored, She was more than willing to start the process on remedy immediately. Full cooperation from this lady and her office was a matter of merely providing documentation, and with my lawyer on retainer, this office was beyond asking my father to comply. They complied for him. About 2 months since I last spoke to my father, and he now had no idea his pension was about to take a serious hit. Below, I'm going to break down how big a turd I put into his bowl of ice cream. My mother's portion was made whole and adjusted to reflect that her portion was brought to maturity and beyond, so his early retirement doesn't affect her fund. So he loses 10 years of valuation to her. He also retired 3 years early, which cocks him down now to 17 years of pension valuation, not 27. If you'd forgotten, my dad had been collecting my mom's money and was overpaid by $30,000 per year for the last 10 years. Like I said, Mom was made whole, so the pension company is going to claw back that overpayment from the base valuation of his current pension fund. I'm not exactly sure what that does to the number, but it effectively nerfs my old man's private retirement fund. He's got government old age pension that he took early too, whoops. My dad did some awful shit to me, but I only had to suffer 17 years of him. My mom still has the high score at 20. As much as I did this for spite and malicious glee, I did do it to give my mom a chance, proper retirement. Chapter 3: Glitter Bombs of Justice. My mother started collecting her pension about 3 months after I contacted the pension office, and to celebrate she bought tickets to New Zealand for the family for Christmas, so we can see our relatives. I was able to get most of my retainer from the lawyer back, and to celebrate, I went online to order a glitter bomb. I was able to ship it to my old man anonymously from another country. God bless the USA. I heard through my sister he opened it up in his stupid red Miata. Ha ha ha. He'll never get rid of it.
Crappy bosses FAFO. I had a job working warehouse delivery for a store. The entire corporate structure was built on treating the people below you like shit. And that was passed down through every level. Managers would just bark orders and bitch you out for any reason they could think of. They paid about 25th over minimum wage. And the bosses drove BMWs and Mercedes. The big boss lived in an $8 million house. Our store was the freight hub for 4 others in the little chain, so we got to know the drivers from the other stores well, as they were always coming to load freight or drop stuff off. One day, we're sitting with 2 drivers from another store, and Buddy remarks that he and his partner are working over 60 hours a week. I say he must be doing okay with all that overtime pay. He says they're not getting it, just paid a straight time rate. I ask him if he signed an averaging agreement. He says no. He shows me his pay stub, and there it is. His partner comes back and confirms all this, and they've been doing it for months. He'd asked his manager about OT, and been told that straight pay was just the way it worked. I tell them that's illegal, and urge them to take it to labor relations. They're reluctant to rock the boat, figuring they'll be fired. So I drop it. We never got any overtime. Our warehouse was busy, our store was not. A couple months later, they're in again. And Buddy's partner tells us he and his girlfriend are moving back east, and he's giving his notice. I tell him again to file a complaint. Nothing to lose now, so he does. A few weeks go by, and when I come in one day, there are expensive boss cars parked all along the loading dock. My workmate says something big is going down. All the managers have been summoned, and are inside with a bunch of people in suits, so we wander upstairs to see what's going on. The company bookkeeper had an office in our store, and handled all the payroll. He was a Chinese immigrant. Nice guy. The bosses were trying to pin this on him, saying he didn't speak English very well, which was true, and had obviously screwed everything up. Turns out he was a pretty cagey guy. He knew what they'd told him to do was illegal, and was able to produce all the records of him telling them that, and of them telling him to basically just shut up and do it. He hands it all over and quits. I see Buddy, with a new partner. A few weeks later, he's got a pay stub for about 15 paychecks worth of earnings. Company got caught for all the overtime pay and a pretty substantial fine on top of that. Added bonus, the second in command had driven over a nail when he parked his silver BMW on the loading dock and had a flat when he came out of the store. He opened his trunk and called me over and said, "Change that for me." I told him sorry. That's not my job, and if I hurt myself, my compensation claim would be denied. As he went in to call a tow truck, I stood on the loading dock and gazed upon all the havoc I had wrought, and my heart was glad. Thank you for watching. Hope you guys enjoy this video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, or maybe tell me what do you think about it. Have a good day. Goodbye, and see ya.